I never expected my job as a correctional officer to come with ghost stories. When I first started at a prison in Texas, I was too focused on keeping my head down and doing the job to pay attention to the whispered tales of haunted units. I figured the older officers told those stories to mess with rookies like me. Ghosts were the last thing on my mind when I pulled on my uniform every day. My job was to manage inmates, not entertain fantasies. One evening, I was partnered with one of the senior officers for a late-night shift. He was the kind of guy who always seemed to have a story ready, whether you asked for it or not. That night, as we made our rounds, he stopped outside a specific unit and leaned in close, his voice low. "This one here," he said, tapping the steel door with his knuckles, "has a reputation. Used to house a guy who choked to death on his food. Ever since then, strange things happen. Bangs on the doors, handprints where there shouldn't be any." I gave him a polite nod and a small chuckle, but I didn't believe a word of it. To me, it sounded like a scare tactic for the new guy. I brushed it off and went on with the shift, convinced I wouldn't give the story a second thought. But I did. A few weeks later, I found myself on the night shift again, this time patrolling alone. The prison was always quieter at night, but that silence could weigh on you, thick and oppressive. I was passing by the unit the older officer had mentioned when I heard it. A deep, echoing bang. My first instinct was to think it was an inmate acting out, maybe someone throwing themselves against the steel door for attention. But when I shone my flashlight into the small window, the cell was empty. Before I could think too much about it, the sound came again, louder this time. I stepped closer, pressing my hand against the door. That's when I saw it. A faint, smudged handprint appeared, right where I had placed mine, only it was smaller. It wasn't there a moment ago. I froze, my mind racing for a logical explanation. Could it have been a leftover mark? Some trick of the light? The older officer's words came flooding back. Bangings on the doors. Handprints where there shouldn't be any. I backed away, my heart pounding, and quickly radioed my partner. He arrived moments later, and I could see the unease in his eyes when I pointed out the print. "It happens sometimes," he said simply, his voice quieter than usual. A few nights later, I was monitoring the cameras in the control room when something caught my eye. On the screen in the day room of the same unit, a shadowy figure moved. It wasn't an inmate. I knew every man assigned to that section, and no one should have been there at that hour. The figure lingered near the corner of the room, then faded, as if it had never been there at all. My partner, sitting next to me, swore under his breath. "Tell me you saw that," he said. I nodded, unable to tear my eyes from the screen. From that night forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in that prison I didn't understand. I still didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was stacking up, and my skepticism was beginning to crack. The older officer's stories weren't just tall tales meant to scare rookies. Something lingered in those halls, something I couldn't explain. Looking back now, that was the first time I truly felt the weight of what it meant to work in a place where the living and the dead seemed to overlap. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was the beginning of a journey that would change the way I saw the world forever. When I transferred to Michigan, I thought the change of scenery might bring some peace of mind. By then, the strange events in Texas had left their mark, but I was determined to leave those memories behind. The prison in Michigan had its own reputation, but I chalked it up to the same kind of tall tales I'd heard before. At least that's what I told myself. It didn't take long for whispers about the condemned section to reach me. Officers avoided it, calling it the dark corner, because of its lack of power and the heavy atmosphere that hung over it. It had been closed for years, but there was no shortage of stories. Some said they'd heard footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Others claimed to feel cold spots that chilled them to the bone, even in the summer heat. I didn't want to feed into the rumors, but when my friend and fellow officer suggested we check it out, my curiosity got the better of me. The condemned section felt different from the moment we stepped in. The air was thicker, heavier, like it was trying to press us back. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, and every sound echoed unnaturally, as if the space were alive. We moved cautiously, my friend leading the way. He was braver than I was, or maybe just more reckless. We hadn't gone far when I saw it. A shadow moved at the edge of my flashlight's beam, quick and unnatural. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely steady. My friend nodded, his expression tight. He was usually the one cracking jokes, but not here, not now. As we pressed on, the shadows seemed to multiply. Every step felt like we were being watched. Then something grabbed me. It wasn't a hand. It was colder, heavier, like ice wrapping around my shoulder. I froze, panic clawing at my chest. My friend turned just in time to see me stumbling back, and that's when it hit him. Whatever force was in that place didn't just stop at grabbing. He was thrown backward, slamming into the wall hard enough to leave a mark. The sound of his body hitting the concrete echoed louder than it should have, and for a moment, I was sure we wouldn't make it out. Somehow we found the strength to run. We didn't look back, though I swear I could hear something following us. Its steps matching ours, but just a fraction of a second behind. When we burst into the main hallway, the oppressive feeling lifted, but the fear stayed. My friend's injuries were undeniable, a bruise already forming where he'd been thrown. He tried to laugh it off, but his eyes gave him away. He was as shaken as I was. After that night, I avoided the condemned section like everyone else. It wasn't just stories anymore. It was real, and I wanted no part of it. But the fear didn't leave me. Every time I passed that part of the prison, I felt it watching, waiting, like it was daring me to come back. The worst part was knowing that no one would believe us. Not really. The condemned section wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it wanted us to know we didn't belong. After everything that happened in Michigan, I needed a change. The weight of those years, the banging doors, the handprints, and that condemned section was heavier than I realized. I convinced myself that moving out to the countryside, near a quiet provincial park, would help. Fresh air, long walks with my dog, and nights spent far from the shadows of prison walls felt like the escape I needed. For a while, it worked. The peace of the park was a salve for my nerves, and I began to feel like I could finally put the past behind me. But then, one night, the park changed. It was late, and the air had that sharp chill of early autumn. The moon was out, casting just enough light to navigate the winding paths. My dog, a sturdy old shepherd mix named Bear, trotted ahead, his nose to the ground. He'd always been fearless, the kind of dog who'd bark at thunder or chase after a deer without hesitation. That night, though, he stopped dead in his tracks. At first, I thought he'd caught the scent of an animal, but when I called his name, he turned and looked at me. There was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. His tail was tucked low and he whined softly, refusing to move forward. I was about to take a step toward him when I felt it. That unmistakable sensation of being watched. My stomach twisted, and I instinctively turned around. That's when I saw it. A figure stood on the path behind me. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Its outline was dark, indistinct, and eerily still. It didn't call out or move. It just stood there, silent and unnerving. My flashlight flickered as I shone it toward the figure, but the beam seemed to struggle, like the light itself didn't want to touch it. I called out, my voice firm but shaking. "Who's there?" No response, just silence. The silence was worse than any answer could have been. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The figure didn't move, but somehow it felt closer. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, and Bear's low growl snapped me back into action. "Let's go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, and we turned to walk away. But as we moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following us. The path felt longer than it ever had before. Every crunch of the gravel under my boots sounded like thunder in the quiet night. I resisted the urge to turn around, but the weight of its presence pressed down on me. Bear stayed close, his hackles raised, as if he knew we weren't alone. When we finally broke through the tree line and reached the clearing near the parking lot, I dared to glance back. The figure was gone, but the fear lingered, as sharp and cold as the night air. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. I locked the doors, drew the curtains, and sat in the dark, replaying the encounter in my mind. That figure wasn't like the shadows in the prison or the icy grip in Michigan. This was different, personal. It felt like whatever I'd tried to leave behind had followed me here, waiting for the right moment to remind me that I'd never truly escape it. The park had always been a place of peace, but now it was just another place I'd come to fear. By the time I found myself working at a travel center in New Mexico, I thought I had left the worst of it behind. The prisons, the park, it all felt like part of a different life, one I had carefully packed away. This new job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and most importantly, it felt safe. The long hours in the kitchen kept my mind occupied, and the open desert skies gave me a sense of distance from everything that had haunted me before. For a while, it almost felt like I could breathe again. The kitchen itself was nothing special. Stainless steel counters, buzzing fluorescent lights, and the hum of industrial appliances. It was a far cry from the oppressive gloom of a prison or the eerie stillness of a dark forest. But the walk-in freezer had a way of unsettling me. It wasn't just the cold or the claustrophobic space. It was the way the sound seemed to die the moment you stepped inside. No hum of the lights, no distant chatter from the dining area. Just silence. One night I was finishing my shift when I heard a crash from the back of the kitchen. The line cook, a young guy who'd only been there a few months, rushed out of the freezer, pale and shaking. He stammered about seeing something in the corner. "A face," he said, staring at him from behind the stacks of frozen boxes. At first I chalked it up to exhaustion or an overactive imagination. I'd seen how long his shifts were, and it wasn't unusual for people to see things when they were tired. But the fear in his eyes was real, and it struck a chord deep inside me. The freezer became a source of tension in the kitchen. People whispered about strange sounds and shadows that seemed to move just out of sight. One night, it was my turn to restock the freezer. I told myself there was nothing to be afraid of, that I was done with ghosts and shadows. But as I stepped inside, the air felt heavier than usual. The silence wrapped around me, almost suffocating. I reached for a box, and that's when I heard it. Soft, eerie laughter, faint but unmistakable. I spun around, my breath clouding in the cold air. Nothing, just rows of shelves and frozen food. But then out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow dart across the back wall. My heart raced as I backed toward the door, trying to stay calm. The laughter grew louder, echoing in the small space, and I felt a sharp, icy breeze rush past me, even though the door was shut. My hand fumbled for the handle, and when I finally burst out into the kitchen, I realized I was shaking. The other staff looked at me, their expressions a mix of concern and fear. I wanted to tell them it was nothing, just a trick of the mind, but I couldn't get the words out. The line cook pulled me aside later that night and told me he'd quit. "Whatever's in there," he said, "it's not just shadows." I didn't argue. He was right. It wasn't just shadows. It never had been. I tried to convince myself that I could endure it, that this job was worth holding on to. But the freezer wasn't the only place where things went wrong. The shadows started appearing in the corners of the kitchen, in the reflections of the stainless steel counters. I'd hear footsteps when I was alone, and feel cold spots in the middle of a warm room. It was as if the ghosts of my past had followed me to New Mexico, refusing to let me go. In the end, I couldn't stay. The travel center became another place I had to leave behind, another reminder that no matter how far I ran, the haunting never ended. I quit the job and moved on, but the memories stayed with me, etched into my mind like scars. Every shadow, every sound, every brush of cold air brought it all rushing back. And even now, as I sit and write this, I can't help but wonder, what is it that ties these places together? Is it me? Or is it something else? Something that has been following me all along?